wcześniej.
On the 24th of November 2010, a few days before the arrival of the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, to Poland, Bronisław Komorowski, the President of the Republic of Poland, called a meeting of the National Security Council. He met with former presidents, prime ministers and ministers of national defence to talk about the Long March. Good morning. Welcome to the press conference of the President of the Republic of Poland. We are preparing for a visit of President Medvedev. We hope that this visit will not be a one-off event, but the beginning of a march in a good direction, as presently we are involved in this march more and more intensively.
Ten marsz w tej chwili coraz intensywniejszy.
Dzień po posiedzeniu.
One day after the meeting, Wojciech Jaruzelski, who was then already accused of communist crimes and had been the dictator of the martial law, the man who in this place and in this office, at this balcony, spent many years of his professional life, his service to Russia and the People's Republic of Poland, wrote a letter to Donald Tusk, thanking him for being invited to such a respectable gathering. I listened with great interest to your very important speech. It allowed me to supplement my historical knowledge and experience with an assessment of the current situation, in particular your conversation with the Russian side. I did not think that at present such tone was possible. Russia is a large country and a considerable factor in the European and world politics. Good neighbourly relations with it are very important. However, the missile argumentation mentioned by you is an example of flexing one's muscles, intended to help in the treatment of complexes and remind of our, rather overestimated, empire status. The presence of Jaruzelski at the meeting of the National Security Council sparked protests, including an open letter which was published by the Rzeczpospolita Daily. Inviting General Jaruzelski to that meeting was some kind of a political demonstration. One may say not necessarily as a joke, but in a moment General Kiszczak will be invited with respect to internal security issues and Jerzy Urban with respect to the freedom of the press. Such a turn to history, which one may hardly explain in any other way than by some circumstances related to what General Jaruzelski once said, that they may fulfill Euro role. Is Wojciech Jaruzelski at the National Security Council meeting a proper person to consult the contemporary Polish-Russian relationships with? It is really not my custom to comment on the list of other guests. The President has the right to invite guests to and construct such meetings according to his own view. I understand his motives. It is an entirely different issue that my experience or the history of Poland has not been easy, and that not every politician is a person with whom I would like to discuss our international relationships. But whether the President invited the right guests, it is for you to assess. General Jaruzelski arouses enthusiasm? Well, you know, one cannot change history. The President has broad powers, but he cannot change history. I will not alter the fact that General Jaruzelski was the President of Poland. Therefore, one should be consistent, and when inviting former presidents to a meeting, invite all of them, and not only some of them. I don't think that all those historical issues should be mixed with the present needs of the Polish state. In response, Jaruzelski writes from his hospital bed as he mentions a letter to Bronisław Komorowski, which the martial law dictator comments on the allegations against him as follows. My competencies with respect to Russia, the Russian mentality, traditions and experiences were appreciated. I had proof of that during the entire past 20 years in many conversations with politicians from various wings. Now they are questioned because, despite my painful personal experiences, I'm not a prisoner of stereotypes. I am not a fierce Russophobe. I am happy with positive trends in the Polish-Russian relationships. Such situation prevailed for several dozen years of the Russian dominance over Poland. These premises and this building house the Russian embassy in Warsaw. Over there is the Ministry of National Defense. Several meters from here, Polish ministers of national defense held office, including Wojciech Jaruzelski, the man who devoted his entire life to Russia while being formerly a Polish army officer and then a Polish politician. Inviting such a person to a meeting of the National Security Council was only one of the many steps made by Donald Tusk, Bronisław Komorowski and their political environment to get Poland and Russia closer to each other, including with respect to the strategic and fundamental area of the cooperation of the Polish army with the Russian army. As early as October 2010, during a meeting of the Committee for the Strategy of Polish-Russian Cooperation, the Polish side developed a concept of the close cooperation with the Russian Ministry of National Defense as part of the reset and transferring the Polish-Russian relations to a higher level. When Radosław Sikorski talked with Sergei Lavrov, their conversation took place at a small balcony with the portraits of Empress Katharina and Emperor Alexander in the background, in a palace on the water in the Łazienki Królewskie Park. The meeting of the Polish-Russian Committee for the Strategic Cooperation also took place there. The work of that committee included discussions on the Polish-Russian cooperation with respect to military issues. In a letter from the Ministry of National Defense to Jarosław Bratkiewicz, we read that the Polish willingness to get closer to Russia on military matters is treated with reserve by the Russians themselves. Keeping good relations with Russia is one of the priorities of the Polish national security policy. The Ministry of National Defense takes steps to return to the military cooperation with the Ministry of National Defense of the Russian Federation. However, we noticed the Russians' reserve and restraint towards the Polish proposals to commence cooperation on a partnership basis. The Polish side took preliminary steps to sign a new agreement on bilateral military cooperation, in connection with the fact that the Russian side shows a very selective interest in such cooperation, limited entirely to the areas where it may achieve measurable advantages. One should use such situations, provided that they are also in the best interest of the Polish side, to establish contacts and build mutual trust. In December 2010, Dmitry Medvedev visited Poland, and by the end of that year, Radosław Sikorski suggested to Donald Tusk to set up a permanent format of the Polish-Russian consultations, which met with a positive reaction of the head of the Prime Minister's office, Tomasz Arabski. In February 2011, during a visit of General Nikolai Patrushev in Poland, a cooperation agreement was signed. During his visit, Nikolai Patrushev met with the then Minister of National Defense, Bogdan Klich. The meeting was recorded in a note describing further ideas to tighten the Polish-Russian cooperation.
Bogdan Klich próbował namówić
Bogdan Klich tried to convince the Russians to hold bilateral meetings with the Minister of National Defense of the Russian Federation and to consult each other with respect to the military forces reform strategy and the purchases of Russian arms. He highlighted the need to unlock the bilateral defense cooperation. I noted that during his intense contact at a high level between Poland and Russia, one feels unsatisfied with the lack of meetings participated by the Ministers of National Defense. At the same time, I commented positively on the quick execution by the Russian side of a contract for purchase of 5 Mi-17 helicopters for the Polish military contingent in Afghanistan. I pointed to the following areas in which there was potential for close cooperation: naval forces, joint maritime rescue exercises, air forces, traffic management, and direction and exchange of information on the situation in airspace. Development of contacts between units stationed in the border area and consultations on the transformation of the armed forces. Minister Nikolai Patrushev said that he would pass on to Anatoly Serdukov the suggestion concerning the convening of a meeting of Ministers of National Defense. He spoke favourably about the possibility of conducting consultations on the reform of the armed forces. Nevertheless, he was clearly critical of the plans to locate the US Air Force units to support temporary rotations of American F-16 and C-130 aircraft in Poland. It is an important place in the history of the Polish-Russian relations after World War II. Yes, because it is the seat of the Ministers of National Defense. Spychalski was here. Jaruzelski was here. And, unfortunately, all the Ministers of National Defense in a free Poland until 2018, when Minister Błaszczak decided to transfer his main office to another, more secure location. I'm saying unfortunately because this building was situated, or is situated, next to the ex-Soviet and now Russian embassy, and it has been subject to constant, so to speak, cyber attacks already after 1991. Earlier, before 1991, it was, so to speak, part of the infrastructure of the Soviet influence in Poland, so there was no need to eavesdrop on anyone in this building.
Reset polsko-rosyjski. On musiał siłą rzeczy objąć.
The Polish-Russian reset necessarily had to involve the issues concerning national security, except that from the very beginning it was, so to say, a false dialogue on the part of the Russian Federation, because the Russians were never inclined to really share any secrets of their national security program. To put it colloquially, they hoaxed the Polish side, talking about Russia's intention to reform, the Russian army's intention to reform, that we must know each other better in order to eliminate fears from bilateral relations.
Po to, żeby wyeliminować lęki z relacji dwustronnych.
However, when Tusk's team, in their eagerness, in the Ministry of National Defense, in this very room, in this building, proposed further cooperation, let me remind that in 2009, and then, with very high intensity after the 10th of April 2010, the Polish Ministry of National Defense, under the lead of Klich and the heads of the General Staff, proposed the initialing of two, one might say, strategic key Polish-Russian agreements in the field of the military.
Strategicznych kluczowych umów w dziedzinie wojska polsko-rosyjskich. Pierwsza to
The first was a renewal of the agreement of 1993 between the Polish and the Russian Minister of National Defense, which had expired. Cooperation between the contracting parties may cover the following areas: exchange of experiences on defence planning, functioning of the armed forces in a democratic society, organisation of the armed forces, including the structure of military units and personnel management policy, logistical support for the armed forces, military education and training of military personnel and military exercises.
W Departamencie Wojskowych Spraw Zagranicznych.
In the beginning of February 2011, the Department of Military Foreign Affairs of the Ministry of National Defense formulated a thesis to justify why a direct agreement between the Polish and the Russian Ministry of National Defense should exist. According to these theses, advanced forms of cooperation were desired.
Współpracy.
We consider the need for cooperation between naval forces, the contacts of the commands of the Navy of the Republic of Poland and the Baltic Fleet of the naval forces of the Russian Federation, and developing common crisis response procedures in the Baltic Sea region as natural and obvious. Over time, more advanced forms of cooperation could be undertaken, such as joint exercises of land forces units.
Propozycja. Według autorów dokumentu.
According to the authors of the document, this proposal was approved by the Prime Minister in December 2010. A note to such effect has been preserved on the part of the document visible on this copy. And the second is the agreement of the General Staffs. Very dangerous from the point of view of the Polish interests. The armed forces of the Republic of Poland and the armed forces of the Russian Federation will also undertake intensive consultations, in particular with respect to the following issues: exchange of experiences in the field of transformation of the armed forces and human resources management, working contacts between military units of the land forces, air force and navy station in the border zone, planning, conducting and observing exercises and training of troops and commands. I have in front of me a completely amazing document, which is a repetition of the points that were included in the draft staff agreement between Poland and the Russian Federation. One of the points refers to the type of planning of joint military operations aimed at restoring, or creating peace in various regions of the world. Please just read. Planning and conducting peace support operations, including engineering supporting crisis response operations. These are the main areas of bilateral cooperation proposed by General Cieniuch, his face-to-face conversation with Makarov in Warsaw in August 2010. And the Russians never signed these agreements. In my opinion, the strategic dialogue, apart from everything I'm talking about here, was also an image game, by which the Russians wanted to warm up their image in the West through Poland, using it as a transmission belt, and win Poland as a partner who would tell the West about a Russia that has given up its imperial aspirations.
Która wyzbyła się swoich imperialnych aspiracji.
The Polish generals did not know that, for example, in Georgia there were forces of the so-called Mirotvorets, i.e. the Russian alleged peacekeeping forces, which in fact were simply part of the Russian apparatus through which the aggression against Georgia was carried out. Well, later we had white convoys, which are also known to everyone who observes political reality. This is, after all, a well-known and age-old way of functioning of the Russian army. Well, but there is no point in discussing whether someone knew something or not, because it is not known that the Polish General Staff and the Ministry of National Defense knew, as is also shown by internal materials produced by these institutions. It was very well informed about what was happening, one might say, in the area of Polish national security. Russia's attitude towards Polish ministerial proposals in the field of military security is perfectly reflected by the lecture delivered in Russia by the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Nikolai Makarov, in the presence of Polish diplomats. The map I have in front of me, which is a fragment of the presentation or lecture of General Makarov, the Chief of Staff of the Russian Army, given on the 17th of November 2011, is only an exemplification of what the Russians really thought about Poland, or, more broadly, about the North Atlantic Pact countries, especially the eastern flank, and how they defined the entire system of threats it posed to them. Poland, along with Estonia, Latvia, Finland and Norway, was recognized as a country that was guided by territorial claims towards its eastern neighbors, such as Belarus, and, in the case of other countries, of course also directly towards the Russian Federation, and therefore the entire eastern flank of NATO, according to the Chief of Staff of the Russian Army, must be treated as a potential adversary, who should simply be neutralized politically in times of peace, and, in conditions of threat of war, or war after, simply neutralize it physically.
Neutralizować politycznie, a w warunkach zagrożenia wojennego czy wojny po prostu zneutralizować fizycznie.
During his lecture in November 2011 in Moscow, one of the Polish diplomats of the Polish embassy in Moscow was present. And, as I understand it, he was shocked by what he saw and heard there. And when he returned to the embassy, he prepared some kind of description of this presentation and sent it to Poland. Among others, this material was sent to the Ministry of National Defense and to the National Security Council.
Między innymi ten materiał trafił do MON-u i trafił również do Biura Bezpieczeństwa Narodowego.
These types of theses, which have no substantive basis, are used by the Russian leadership to justify the current organizational and technical modernization of the armed forces, leading to an increase in the military potential of the Russian Federation, especially in the Western strategic direction. In order to avoid an escalation of tension in the public sphere, General Makarov's theses should be downplayed as frivolous. Alternatively, we should express disbelief that a high-ranking officer in the army of nuclear power could demonstrate such gross incompetence. The officials decided there was no point in inflating it excessively in the media, because it could be perceived by the Russians as a signal to withdraw from the strategic dialogue with the Republic of Poland as part of a reset. Contacts between the Polish Chief of Staff, General Cieniuch, and the Russian General Makarov also resulted in a proposal submitted by the Russians to establish a permanent telephone connection between the Ministry of National Defence's operational center in Warsaw and the command of the Russian Baltic Fleet in the Kaliningrad Oblast.
w obwodzie kaliningradzkim.
The Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, General Makarov, proposed establishing a direct telephone connection between the Russian military command in the Kaliningrad Oblast and the Crisis Management Center of the Ministry of National Defense. In the future, this would allow to avoid misunderstandings concerning the activities of the armed forces. Attempts to include Russians in the strategic dialogue on defense also took faithfully compliant forms of invitations and proposals submitted by the authorities of the Polish Military University of the National Defense to its Russian counterpart. For this purpose, the then rector of this university, Bogusław Pacek, met with the Russian ambassador and sent humble letters to the Russian defense attaché at the embassy in Warsaw, persuading that General Nikolai Makarov, the chief of the Russian staff, should give lectures to Polish officers and future officers studying at the Academy of National Defense. Continuing the current activities aimed at initiating contacts between the National Defense University in Warsaw and the Academy of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, I would like to thank the Colonel for his personal commitment and support for this initiative. I would like to renew the invitation sent in August this year to Colonel General Sergei Makarov to visit Warsaw. I am convinced that our personal meetings and the possibility of direct discussion would create the most appropriate atmosphere for talks, which in turn would contribute to formulating specific proposals. Interestingly, the most ardent supporters of the reset with Russia can be said to be blind. Having all the information I am talking about here, and, for example, as late as in 2014, Deputy Minister of National Defense, Robert Kupiecki, wrote in a fundamental note regarding the possible involvement of the Russian side in the current political crisis in Ukraine. Moscow was not interested in the escalation of the political crisis in Ukraine. The goal is to maintain the political status quo and block the possibility of any formal ties between Kiev and the West. An open military involvement of the Russian Federation in Ukraine is unlikely. However, it is possible in the event of a complete degradation of security situation in its territory. Every sentence is false. Why did this dialogue make no sense and had to be inauthentic? Well, because there is a permanent, or one might say, strategic difference, a conflict that cannot be resolved in the course of political dialogue between the strategic interests of the Russian Federation and Poland's presence in NATO, and therefore also the strategic interests of the Republic of Poland.
Obecnością Polski w NATO I w związku z tym
And the Russians, in fact, did not hide it. And in some situations, they even provoked the Polish side by saying that Poland is simply the eastern flank of NATO.
Stronę polską, mówiąc o tym, że Polska jest po prostu wschodnią flanką NATO.
And there are various types of conflicts, perhaps even in the future. And Poland, for example, during the Zapad exercises in the following years, was a practice object of aggression or preemptive maneuver of the united Russian and Belarusian forces.
Zjednoczonych sił rosyjskich I białoruskich. I to jest, można powiedzieć,
and this, one may say, is the essence of the nonsense that we can talk about in the context of military or strategic dialogue.
Całość tych rozmów, w których Polska
All these talks, in which Poland tried to encourage Russia to achieve strategic military rapprochement, took place in the context of Vladimir Putin's doctrine, already known to the whole world, which assumed that his goal was to push NATO countries out of regions that were part of the Russian Empire before the collapse of the USSR. On the 10th of February 2007, at the Bayerischer Hof Hotel in Munich, as every year, the International Security Conference was held. The Munich Security Conference, as it's called, the most important event in the world's geopolitical calendar. Presidents, prime ministers, heads of services, foreign ministers and defense ministers come here and discuss matters on international security. Also in 2007, such a discussion took place, and it took place in an atmosphere in which, not so far away from here in Switzerland, a company had already been established which later became the owner of the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. There were people in the room prepared to be shortly doing big geopolitical business with the Russian Federation, and Vladimir Putin entered the scene. He began his speech with the following words. Ladies and gentlemen, dear chairman of this conference, I hope that after what I'm about to say here, you will not turn off the microphone and show me a red card. You won't turn on the red light. Then Vladimir Putin gave a speech that went down in history as the one in which he declared war on Western and NATO countries. However, the vast majority of representatives of these countries who were sitting in the audience did not notice it or did not want to notice it.
albo nie chciała zauważyć.
If my considerations seem to our colleagues to be too harsh or inaccurate, polemic, please do not be angry with me. It's just a conference, after all. I hope that after 2 or 3 minutes of my speech, Mr. Cenckiewicz will not turn on the red light for me. The process of NATO expansion has no connection either with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it is a serious provocative factor that reduces the level of mutual trust. We have a legitimate right to ask directly against whom this expansion is being carried out. What happened to the assurances given by Western partners after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact? The conference in Munich was attended by Wolfgang Schäuble, former president of the Bundestag, former Minister of Finance and former Minister of the Interior of the Federal Republic of Germany. I also attended the Munich Security Conference, but I did not listen to Putin's speech in person. According to what I remember, at the time we were still convinced. We believed that we could solve certain issues better by having partnership relations with Putin's Russia. After all, we were, to some extent, on a path that naturally ran from Gorbachev through Yeltsin, according to the principle that now peace is secured and we will work together. Thanks to closer and tighter cooperation, it will get better and better.
Der Friede ist gesichert und wir werden zusammenarbeiten durch immer engere Zusammenarbeit.
Vladimir Putin said these words in February 2007, and I never took them back. In the meantime, he finished the genocidal war in Chechnya and attacked Georgia, step by step, showing that the Munich concept is not only words, but also actions. Putin said when he started the war against Ukraine that NATO should return to its 1991 borders. What does that mean? This means that Poland should be subordinate to Russia, just like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia and Romania. Half of the Germans. Yes, half of the Germans. That's what he meant. So no one should be naive. Simultaneously with the talks in which Poland wanted to tighten cooperation with the Russian Federation, the Polish General Staff was preparing documents assessing the mutual potential of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the Polish army as part of the analysis of a potential armed conflict and attack on Poland from the east. There are the so-called plans for the use of armed forces, also known as PUSH. According to a series of recently declassified documents, the leadership of the Polish forces was of the opinion that the condition of the Polish armed forces in the event of possible aggression from Russia was so terrible that it would be impossible to put up any independent resistance for longer than less than 2 weeks. We read about it in this previously secret document. Considering the enemy's quantitative and qualitative advantage, in particular in missile forces and artillery, aviation and air defence systems, the fulfilment of the country defence mission by the armed forces of the Republic of Poland, without the support of the alliance due to the lack of a political decision, will be possible for a limited time, i.e. 10 to 14 days. General Dariusz Wronski was at that time the commander of the 1st Aviation Brigade of the Land Forces. In the exercises we conducted at that time, it was also assumed that the Polish army and Polish subunits would wait for about 30 days for the approach of NATO forces in their actions to delay the enemy. But this was only a hypothetical assumption. It could be 30 days, it could actually come. But it was never assumed that any moves by NATO would be made to supplement or strengthen the Polish forces. So I don't really know how NATO would then help Poland. Let me ask you, General. The exercises that were carried out mention 30 days, but the documents specify a maximum of 14. I think that these 14 days were probably based on the assumptions of hypothetical defense, effective defense, because I can't call it anything else. And the use of practically all the forces that Poland had at its disposal, regardless of what tasks they were intended for. This is a very optimistic deadline. because there was also one exercise at that time that said 5 to 10 days, a week, or even a month. Warsaw very rarely appeared in such defence analyses or documents that we prepared for defence and combat.
Do walki. Z reguły pojawiały się rzeczywiście
As a rule, towns such as Grudziądz, Toruń, Bydgoszcz, and smaller ones such as Garwolin in the southern region were taken into account. Quite often, they were towns that seemed to mark the Vistula trail. Warsaw itself has always been carefully omitted in all this, so perhaps to avoid dissemination of information, news or knowledge on this subject, it was simply omitted.
była ona po prostu pomijana.
O tym, co z perspektywy żołnierza oznacza horyzont.
We asked a former Polish soldier at one of the training grounds about what a horizon of 10 to 14 days of combat capability means in the event of an attack from Russia. Strategy sometimes forces difficult actions and difficult decisions. However, we know the history of Polish weapons. We are aware that the Polish soldiers fights until the end. And this would probably be the case if the defence plans you mentioned were implemented. The forces we had at that time would probably have fought until the very end, because I can't imagine a Polish soldier retreating from Warsaw and defending on the Odra river line. If we have defence plans for 10 to 14 days, and we know that the arrival of Allied forces may take months, then this should result in consequences regarding the armament of the armed forces and changing the methods of functioning. Only you, sir, assumed defence, and it looks like they assumed that the reset would last, so it looks like they didn't want to defend themselves. You assumed the defence of Poland, and if we read it this way, well, then they were fine as it was, and they assumed that it would continue to happen, that maybe they would invite Lavrov again and pay tribute to him, or in some other version, maybe the Germans will stick up for them in Moscow, and everything will be okay. Everything will be fine.
Będzie wszystko w porządku.
Declassified staff documents describe not only the time during which Poland was to defend itself, which is obviously shorter than the time needed for the reaction of Allied countries, but also directly defines the territory in which Poland intended to defend itself. Those ruling Poland at that time defined the line on which they intended to base their defence, i.e. the so-called strategic frontier. In the event of an independent defensive operation, the armed forces of the Republic of Poland, after operational development in accordance with the applicable use plan, will begin to defend the territory of the state in conditions of a significant advantage of a potential enemy, with the objective of delaying its offensive actions and ultimately stopping it on a precisely defined terrain frontier, and thus creating conditions for the arrival and reception of alliance forces, which allows us to push the potential enemy out of the country's territory in a joint Allied operation and thus regain the previously temporarily lost area and recreate the state's borders. What is this concept of strategic frontier? A strategic frontier is a place that is crucial from the point of view of the operation's activities. A strategic frontier is something that is most important on the front at a given moment. Yes, that is something that the enemy cannot pass through. The concept of defending and establishing a strategic frontier within the borders of the Polish state meant assuming that some part of the Polish territory would fall into the hands of the Russians, which in practice means giving up any part of the territory of the Russian Federation. We saw this during the war in Ukraine that has been going on since 2014. When the Ukrainians recaptured the north of the country, the world saw photos from Bucha. Bucha, Hostomel, Borodianka, the outskirts of Kharkov, Mariupol, Kramatorsk, rubble instead of a settlement. This is what Bishov looks like after being shelled by the Russians. near Chernihiv, a brutal attack on civilians. My house and dogs burned down like a match. We lost everything. Over the last 3 days, the Russians have not made significant progress on the front, but they are still committing war crimes and bombing cities and civilian buildings. Let's look at the war in Ukraine, where roughly 20% of the territory has been occupied by, well, the same army, the same state that was considered here theoretically as an adversary, which has occupied about 20% of the territory at the moment when we are recording these words, is holding about 20% of the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine has lost perhaps even hundreds of thousands of soldiers trying to regain the territories that were occupied. Daily news broadcasts bring information on regaining an area, for example, 9 kilometers squared, 6 kilometers squared, and this information is immediately published all over the world. It is considered a success. What are the real chances of regaining the territory that is occupied by such armies as the Russian one in a counter-offensive? Some actions that are supposed to launch a counter-attack on this strategic frontier and push this potential aggressor back behind the territory of the Republic of Poland.
Bardzo trudne, jeżeli mówimy choćby w kontekście właśnie linii Wisły.
It is very difficult if we're talking in the context of the Vistula line. Why? Because it is a water obstacle with a high degree of difficulty, and overcoming it and transferring a significant number of troops to each side causes very large technical and logistical complications, especially if we take into account that it is happening under enemy fire. When countering enemy artillery, if there was a counter-offensive from the west across the Vistula, it would also be extremely complicated, a very difficult operation in logistic terms that would certainly not last or be prepared overnight. This cannot be done on the fly. The strategic frontier was defined very precisely in the documents created by the General Staff during the governments of Donald Tusk and Ewa Kopacz, subsequent ministers of national defense Bogdan Klich and Tomasz Siemioniak, and also during the presidency of Bronisław Komorowski. This can be seen in these documents, which are presented to the public for the first time. According to these documents, Poland has a defined strategic border in half of its territory on the geographical line marked by the course of the Vistula River. This is described, among others, in these two documents. In the event of aggression against Poland, the armed forces of the Republic of Poland will defend its territory, airspace and territorial waters in order to delay as much as possible the pace of the enemy's offensive operation and stop its attack on the Vistula and Dnieprz rivers at the furthest. In the next document, the strategic border is also described in the lower reaches of the Vistula River in northern Poland. It is defined like this. In the fifth stage, after withdrawing to the strategic frontier, the main effort will be focused on stopping the enemy's attack, maintaining bridgeheads on the right bank of the Vistula in areas number 1, Grudziądz, Toruń, Bydgoszcz, and number 2, Otwock, Wolin, Riki, as well as securing the reception of Allied forces. Maintaining bridgeheads usually fails in such a situation. If the attack was carried out in accordance with the doctrine, whether Russian or Belarusian, because it is almost the same, it would be by armoured mechanized units to the Vistula line. No bridgehead would remain. We would have no bridgeheads along any of the rivers. They would probably be pushed into the water. Perhaps what would have crossed the Vistula River would survive. However, it is a strange, not to say shocking, defence strategy because it assumes de facto giving up half of the country's territory, maybe not without a fight, but without any decisive, strong resistance, because it assumes entrenching on the left side of the Vistula and waiting for the support of the Allies, which we don't know when it might come.
I oczekiwanie na wsparcie sojuszników, które nie wiemy, kiedy mogłoby nadejść.
Defined in this way, the strategic goals of the defensive action against an attack from Russia mean the assumption that the population living on the Polish territory will be handed over to the hands of Russian war criminals who have already shown during two Chechen wars, Georgia and Ukraine, how they treat the civilian population of the conquered territories. The zone intended to be occupied by Russia included the following cities: Rzeszów, Lublin, Białystok, Elbląg, Toruń, Przemysł, Zamość, Suwałki, Krosno, Sanok, Stalowa Wola, Siedlce, Biała Podlaska, and many, many others. This means that the Lesser Poland, Podkarpacie, Świętokrzyskie, Mazowsze, Podlasie, Warmian Mazurian, Kowalski Pomorski, and Lublin voivodeships were handed over to Russia. Until this place, or rather the other bank of the Vistula, are in Grudziądz, in a place that defines the strategic frontier, the Russian army attacking Poland was supposed to reach, and the Polish army assumed that it would retreat to this place. In practice, this means that according to the defense plans approved by the Polish authorities, the entire territory of the Republic of Poland located on the other side of the Vistula was to be exposed and was to be defended only to the extent that the Polish army was to be able to oppose the Russian army at that side of the Vistula River. The same documents show that the superiority of the Russian army in basically all types of armed forces was so great that any defensive effort could be used as much as possible between 10 and 14 days. This meant that the Polish population on the other side of the Vistula was, by definition and assumption, given to the hands of the Russians. A country that was already practicing strategic nuclear attacks, including on the capital of Poland, Warsaw. You have declassified documents that show that these are several assumptions for the defense of the Republic of Poland. Maybe I will start and ask you for a comment on the document, which is an extract, among others, of the concept of operation for the plan for the use of the armed forces of the Republic of Poland, Independent Defense Operation, Warta 00101. And in this document, we read the following provision. The mission, in the event of aggression against Poland, the Polish armed forces or the armed forces of the Republic of Poland will defend its territory, airspace and territorial waters in order to delay as much as possible the pace of the enemy's offensive operation and stop its attack on the Vistula and Wieprzew rivers at the furthest. What does it mean? This means that the entire eastern Poland has been handed over to the aggressor, and we all see what is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine was attacked by Russia. The recaptured areas include, for example, Bucha, Irpin, places where the Russians committed war crimes by murdering civilians, and fighting is still going on. Ukrainians are trying to retake the territories occupied by Russia. They do it with great difficulty, because it is very difficult to retake territories that were occupied by the enemy, by the aggressor. So, those who ruled Poland until 2015 will prepare for us the fate that Ukrainians are experiencing today, if these plans had actually been maintained.
Jakiego dziś doświadczają Ukraińcy, gdyby te plany rzeczywiście zostały utrzymane.
Jeżeli przyjmiemy, że jest to rok 2011 mniej więcej, że likwidacji ulegają...
If we assume that is more or less 2011, the Polish elite units that had their tasks assigned to these directions are being liquidated.
Część tych jednostek zniknęła bezpowrotnie.
If we finally assume that some of these units have disappeared irretrievably, it can actually be said that their hair stands on end because of this. Who will defend and who will guard these defensive frontiers of the first borders, and then the second line of defense? And finally, precisely that strategic line, which, according to the documents from that time, was supposed to be located on the line of the Vistula and Wieprz rivers.
Myślę, że nie byłoby chyba...
I think that there would probably be no commander who believed in the success of this type of operation in stopping the enemy, especially since this enemy is, when it comes to land forces, air forces and navies, much stronger and more numerous.
Lotnicze oraz marynarkę o wiele silniejszy, liczniejszy, który...
And who, by its commitment and acting by surprise, may reach this line in a very short time.
bardzo krótkiego czasu dojść do tejże...
I think it is a great surprise for the commanders that these are the forces that are reduced, the forces whose units are subjected to long-term detraining processes. That is, the training process is reversed and even stopped. For example, by the liquidation of shooting ranges, by the liquidation of training grounds.
Czyli odwrócenia procesu szkolenia i zatrzymanie wręcz chociażby przez likwidację strzelnic, przez likwidację poligonów.
In fact, they would not be able to fight for longer than a few or dozen days. So I assume that someone planned to deliberately and consciously give up this area, just in a very short time.
Po prostu w ciągu bardzo krótkiego czasu.
Basically, the whole concept of defense is based on giving up half of the territory, hiding behind the river with the thought that Allied help will come in the meantime. Besides, it is written here, expressive verbis, Poland, and I would also assume Poland is not able to defend itself if it were not for the fact that these plans look very hopeless. And if they are combined with the political concept, which you, Mr. General, mentioned, that is, the disarmament of the Polish army, and with a strategic dialogue with the Russian Federation and an attitude towards full transparency of everything we have.
Pełną przejrzystość wszystkiego, co mamy, no to można zapytać...
So one could ask, how could Poland be defended at that time? Because it is clear from these plans that despite the reset, despite the strategic dialogue and repeated assurances that Russia does not threaten Poland, let me remind you, Mr. General, you probably know it. The White Paper of the National Security Council or the Strategic Defense Review, where either Russia does not exist or, if it exists, it is said there would be no open armed conflict in this close strategic environment of Poland.
Otoczce Polski nie dojdzie po prostu do otwartego konfliktu zbrojnego. Innymi słowy, że
In other words, that Russia does not threaten Poland.
Chyba rzeczywiście świadomie...
It seems clear. I think it was deliberately assumed that we would consciously lose that part of the forces and resources that would be located in the eastern part of Poland up to the border of the Vistula. And practically, whoever manages to get through the Vistula or Vipshru to the other side will have a chance to save himself. The rest just have to bleed out or give up.
Poddać.
Przyjęcie założenia, że państwo polskie...
Adopting the assumption that in the event of a possible attack from Russia, the Polish state will defend itself only from the border of the Vistula River means a tacit acceptance of the fact that after such a conflict, if the Polish state still existed at all, it would be smaller by more than half, means a de facto consent to change Polish borders.
Jak panowie ćwiczyli...
When you practice variants of war with the Russian Federation, the direction of the Russian attack was, as I understand it, from the Belarusian direction, from the Kaliningrad Oblast and the Baltic Fleet. As I understand it, from these three directions, regardless of the air forces, missile forces, but generally it was the direction of attack. These were the directions of attack, weren't they?
Natarcia były główne, to tak jak mówiłem.
These were, of course, the main directions of attack. As I said, the Brest Gate, and from the border of Belarus towards Warsaw, the second direction was the northeastern operational and strategic direction, i.e. from the Królewieck Oblast.
Tam uporczywa obrona.
Their persistent defence was planned by units including the then 49th Combat Helicopter Regiment, of which I was the commander, and of course the Baltic direction, i.e. entering through the three cities from Żuławy, flooding Żuławy, breaking the flood embankments, and entering and taking over the industrial base of three cities. These were basically the key scenarios for entering Poland.
Kluczowe scenariusze wejścia do Polski. Jeżeli chcielibyśmy, zakładając, że to
If we wanted, assuming that everything would happen at the same time, then all the units would have to be thrown to the defence, which would, so to say, expose the western part, i.e. on the western side of the Vistula, and then we would be trapped because we would throw all our forces which were in Poland.
wszystkie siły, które w Polsce.
Kluczowym elementem
The key element of the Russian plan of land attack on Poland is the passage of the attacking troops through the so-called Brest Gate, i.e. a strip of land between the Narew and the Bug rivers approximately 80 kilometers wide. The designated place of the intersection of the Narew River and the border with Belarus in the north, and in the south, the place where the Bug River, from the border with Belarus, turns into the Polish territory towards Warsaw. The Narew and Bug rivers, approaching each other near Warsaw, together with the southern mouth of the Wieprz River into the Vistula, determine the directions of offensive actions against Poland, which may lead to a quick reach of Warsaw from the side of Belarus and Russia.
Rosyjska doktryna przewidywała uderzenie przez właśnie.
The Russian doctrine envisaged an attack through the Brest Gate.
To tak zwana cieśnina suwalska.
This is one direction. The other probable direction is the so-called Suwałki Strait, or the Suwałki Gate, as some people call Poland, because geographically it was assumed that after breaking through our border, the Russian tank armies and motorized fronts, because we are talking about fronts, should have easily broken through to Western Europe over the Central European plain.
Powinny bez problemu przebić się do Europy Zachodniej i tak zakładała.
And that's why this doctrine assumed, which is why this place is of key importance, because it is a natural isthmus that can lead to the lowlands in the central, eastern or western Poland,
Czy zachodniej Polsce,
through which you can easily get to Western Europe.
na zachód Europy.
Zadaniem wojska polskiego dziś
The task of the Polish army today is to defend every piece of territory of the Republic of Poland. We are establishing units in the east of our country and equipping the army with modern weapons to deter the aggressor. I mean, symbolically, they opened the Brest Gate, inviting the aggressor to the territory of the Republic of Poland. They, i.e. the government of the PO and PSL coalition, the government of Donald Tusk, or the government of the Law and Justice, closed the Brzesko Gate.
w ten sposób, że odnowiliśmy dywizję. Dziś jest 18.
We closed it by renewing the division. Today, there is the 18th Mechanized Division named after General Buch, a victim of the Smolensk disaster, a general who once commanded the 1st Mechanized Division in Warsaw. And by equipping the army of the 1st Brigade, which is part of the 18th Division, with Abrams tanks, and soon also with Apache attack helicopters, we symbolically closed the Brzesko Gate. The combination of Abrams with Apaches, tanks, and with attack helicopters is an impenetrable barrier.
Zaporę nie do przebicia. Jeżeli jeszcze do tego dodamy fakt,
If we add the fact of a large number of tanks and helicopters, we will have a fleet second only to the United States in terms of attack helicopters, and second when it comes to Abrams tanks in the world. And then we actually deter the aggressor in a real way.
rzeczywiście w sposób realny odstraszamy agresorów.
We will also add HIMARS, 500 HIMAR launchers, and Korean Chunmoo launchers. So we are building strong artillery to deter the aggressor, so that the aggressor will not dare to attack Poland.
Odważył się na zaatakowanie Polski.
Jednocześnie z procesem
Simultaneously with the process of building a defense strategy on the Vistula River, the process of liquidating military units throughout the country continued. The number of liquidated units reached up to 800, depending on how they were counted.
Myślenia zawartego w tak zwanych...
The symbol of this thinking contained in the so-called forests, i.e. the plan for the use of armed forces from 2011, is making Grudziądz part of the strategic frontier from Grudziądz, in which, according to the statistics concerning the orders that the command of the Polish army and the Minister of the National Defense issued at that time, 19 different units and structures of the Polish army were liquidated. So what kind of frontier is this in which there is no longer a soldier of the Polish army, or in which the Polish soldier is simply a phenomenon because the units were liquidated?
jedną z jednostek znajdujących
One of the units located east of the Vistula was commanded by General Dariusz Wronski. Here is his story regarding the plans to liquidate this particular unit.
To ja spytam o jeszcze jedną rzecz.
So let me ask you about one more thing. Your experience regarding
rozwiązywania, likwidowania
exactly dissolving liquidations of units. You said on this matter something different than what your bosses wanted to hear.
Jednym z powodów, dla którego złożyłem wypowiedzenie,
Yes, this is one of the reasons why I terminated my army service in 2014. There were actually two factors at the end. One concerned helicopters and a tender for multi-role helicopters for the Polish army. The second reason was that the dissolution or disbanding of units that I saw and experienced firsthand was not compatible with my perception and my entire life experience as a professional soldier.
nie godziły się z moim postrzeganiem i z moim całym doświadczeniem życiowym jako żołnierza zawodowego.
And the letter, which was addressed directly to the commander of the 1st Aviation Brigade of the Land Forces, I was the commander then, requiring the signing of documents regarding the liquidation of the 49th Air Base in the Pruszcz Gdański.
49. bazy lotniczej w Pruszczu Gdańskim, gdzie osobiście
In reply to which I personally prepared a document for the General Commander with the conclusion that the liquidation of this unit, when we have threats from the east, when we have various armed conflicts in the world, will be an irretrievable loss.
zagrożenia ze wschodu, kiedy mamy różne konflikty zbrojne na świecie, będzie stratą bezpowrotną i
That I do not agree with this approach if, despite everything, the unit is dissolved. We are talking about Pruszcz. History will never forgive us for this.
tego nigdy nie wybaczy. I nie podpisałem dokumentów.
And I didn't sign the documents. I sent my letter to the General Commander. After 2 days, when he was introduced to this document, he told me to appear for punishment with the people who prepared this document, because I had prepared this document personally.
Ponieważ ten dokument przygotowałem osobiście, stawiłem się i wytłumaczyłem, że takiego
I showed up and I explained that I would not sign such a document. Thanks to this, there was a delay and a promise that this unit was not yet assigned, which was untrue. It was intended for liquidation.
Były nowe lotnisko, nowe
There
położenie.
was a new airport, a new location was planned, people were already looking for work, and in December 2016, the operation of this unit was to be closed.
Zamknięcie działalności tejże jednostki.
w planach obrony.
The defence plans approved by Bogdan Klich also included tasks for airmobile troops commanded by General Wronski. In the second stage, the forces of 4 general military brigades and 3 battalions of air mobile troops, 1 air mobile brigade, and groups in the obstruction zone will carry out delaying operations on subsequent frontiers while maintaining their combat capability to conduct operations in a later period. What does this mean in the language of simple people? The author of this document was going to destroy these subunits, because these subunits of the 25th Air Cavalry Brigade are not dedicated to this type of task. These are completely different tasks, and it is strange that the task of elite, full-blooded, well-trained units, such as the 25th Brigade, served as an ambiguous commander, i.e., at a critical moment. They were used or planned to be used in places and areas where the army expected help and was then supposed to gain an advantage and eliminate the threat in a given section, and not to deploy assault units. This means putting the troopers on helicopters and rushing them or destroying the enemy from the air. No commander of the 25th would perform such a task. So, such a task is a bit... General, this was created in P5, i.e. in the operational management of the General Staff, from which the General Gotsu, who later became the Chief of Staff, came. Yes, it seems that they probably lacked specialists or experts from experienced people in the field of military aeromobiles then. I don't remember anyone consulting with me the preparation of such an operation or the use of forces for this type of tasks. I think it probably resulted from theory and desire, which actually found us later in the documents themselves, and not on the real battlefield. On a real battlefield, these units would be liquidated very quickly. Minister, you said that the defence border would be established on the Vistula River. On the line about which we are talking here, we read in these documents, you used the phrase that was Germany's defence. How do you understand this? Well, when forces were concentrated on the western border of our country, let me remind you that the best Polish division was the 11th Armoured Division, in which the 10th Brigade, based in Żagań, Świętoszów, was to constitute the 5th Armoured Division. So this brigade could defend Germany against Russia.
Czegoż mogła ta brygada bronić? Niemiec przed Rosją. Wyobraźmy sobie,
let's imagine that Poland is attacked in the same situation as before 2015. Dislocation of these Leopard tanks from Żagań, Świętoszów to the east, how it would take place. Let's remember the photos from September 1939. Let's see in these photos how crowded the roads were. And the number of cars today as compared to September 1939 is gigantic. So these roads would be crowded. When this brigade would be transferred to the east to theoretically defend the east of our country, it was all fiction. It was a theory which maybe was useful for the personal careers of these people, but it was contrary to the interests of our country. It was contrary to the security of the Republic of Poland.
Sprzeczna z interesami naszego kraju, była sprzeczna z bezpieczeństwem Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej. Mówiąc symbolicznie,
symbolically speaking, they invited Lavrov, showed portraits of Empress Catherine II, Emperor Alexander, paid tribute, surrendered, and raised a white flag. They changed the location of the Polish army, decided to defend the Germans against Russia and give up half of the territory of our country. Well, yes, that's the decision they made. Now let's assess whether this is a decision that builds the independence of our country and strengthens Poland. Well, no, on the contrary. And they entrusted the fate of Poland and Poles to our allies, especially Germany, because they thought that the Germans would defend us against Russia. The Germans, who, together with Moscow and the Russians, built Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, they were supposed to defend Poland against Russia. And let's look at the history of our country. Partitions, the first partitions of the 18th century, another partition of Poland in 1939, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Well, of course, it is a different Germany now, but let's be realistic. We can defend Poland when we have a strong Polish army, and it's not about us wanting a war. On the contrary, we don't want a war. We want to deter the aggressor this way. We want to show that it will not pay off to attack Poland.
Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni. Wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane, bo jesteś naszym wrogiem albo naszym